Well, if you have your Bibles with you today, I would invite you to join me in turning in them to the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs comes right after the book of Psalms. So since those are two of the larger books in the Old Testament, you shouldn't have too much trouble finding them. And I would encourage you to go to the book of Proverbs today, because we're going to do a little bit of looking through some of the messages that are there in this book. But first of all, we're going to look at the very beginning of it, verses 1 through 7 of chapter 1. Proverbs 1, verses 1 through 7. And our highlight verse today, as we continue in our series on 12 verses from the Old Testament, or the Old Testament in 12 verses, will be verse 7 of chapter 1 of Proverbs. But let's begin at verse 1. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. For learning about wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for gaining instruction in wise dealing, righteousness, justice, and equity, to teach shrewdness to the simple, knowledge and prudence to the young. Let the wise also hear and gain in learning, and the discerning acquire skill. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God for his word to us this morning. Well, I've had quite a long history with the book of Proverbs, dating back to my childhood years, I guess into my later childhood years. I'm not sure what year it would have been that a gentleman started coming to our little church in Camrose, and I'm not even sure I remember his name. I can pull up his face. I think his last name was Dale. But he kind of took a little bit of an interest in me, and he talked to me about a practice that he had been doing for a number of years, and that he recommended to me, which was to take the book of Proverbs. Since there's 31 chapters in the book of Proverbs, and there's 31 days in most months, and to just begin reading the book of Proverbs, one chapter a day, at bedtime, to let the word of a whole chapter of scripture just kind of wash over me like a bath. He said, if you read and focus in on one verse of the Bible, it's like having a meal. But if you just read a whole chapter, it's like having a bath or a shower, and you can just kind of bask in that. So I took him up on that challenge, and I began reading through the book of Proverbs every month. And I have more than one memory of propping myself up on my elbow and having my little children's Bible there on me in my bed, and reading and falling asleep over whatever chapter I was in. I found the book of Proverbs has a lot of pretty interesting stuff in it. It's got some pretty memorable images and sayings, and here's the part where I'd like to have a little participation this morning. So swords drawn, Merle, phones drawn. I'd like to do a little bit of a tour of some of the things that stood out to me as a kid in the book of Proverbs. It's got a couple great sayings on laziness. So chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. Who can get there and read that to us? Chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. Go ahead and read it out loud, nice and loud.
Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise. Which having no captain, overseer, or ruler, provides her supplies in the summer and gathers her food in the harvest.
Go to the ant, you sluggard. Thank you, Ken. There's another memorable saying on laziness in chapter 26, verse 14. Anybody want to go there? Go for it, Shirley.
As a door turns on its hinges, so a sluggard turns on his bed.
As a door turns on its hinges, so a sluggard turns on his bed. Oh, so great. There's a saying on meddling in other people's business, chapter 26, verse 17. You got it, Leanne? 26:17. Yeah. Yeah, something along the line in the version that I used to read. He who meddles in someone else's argument is like a man who yanks a dog's ears. Yeah. There's a great saying on generosity in chapter 11, verse 25. Proverbs 11:25. Who's got it? Yes. Those who refresh others will themselves be refreshed. There's some famous sayings in the book of Proverbs on conflict in marriage. Merle, you got to read this one. 27:15. Come on.
Quarrelsome wife is like the dripping leaky roof in a rainstorm.
Say that again one more time, a little louder.
A quarrelsome wife is like a dripping of a leaky roof in a rainstorm.
Yeah, there's a few like that one. I'll leave it at one. How about this one on parenting? 22 verse 6. Oh, you're good, Jude. Yes, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Oh, there's the odd head scratcher. How about chapter 26, verses 4 and 5? Read them together.
Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will also be like him. Answer a fool as his folly deserves, that he not be wise in his own eyes.
So in 2 consecutive verses, you have the exact opposite advice. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or he'll be wise in his own eyes, or you'll be like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, or he'll be wise in his own eyes. Oh, so which is it? And then there's my personal favorite. Do I dare doing this? Do you know what a beautiful woman who doesn't show discretion is like? Chapter 11, verse 22. How about you, Jackie? You want to say this one? 11:22.
As a ring of gold in a swine's snout, so is a lovely woman who lacks discretion.
Yes, like a gold ring in a pig's snout is a beautiful woman who shows no discretion. My goodness. I think I won some kind of a prize in a game we played at Bible college because I knew that one. Proverbs also contains some of the most memorized verses in the whole Bible. Do you know what that would be? 3, 5, and 6. Let's say it together. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight, or direct your paths. Yes. Whereas some people in our college and most schools on their college jacket would have the names of sports that they excelled in printed as a badge on their sleeve. Judy, when I met her, had Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 in the badge on her sleeve, along with, I think, foosball, which she also excelled at. Well, the promise of this series on the Old Testament in 12 verses was that we would look into all the major sections of the Old Testament and find its characteristic messages. And so today we are looking into the wisdom literature of the ancient Jewish people. And I want to show you this, hopefully I can get this to come up. Come on. Yeah. This is this is a chart that shows you the major divisions of the Old Testament, and boy, does it ever look simple and easy to understand, eh? Yeah, no, not really. But you'll see that when we think about our Bible, we often think about it in terms of the Pentateuch, or the Torah, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's known as the Pentateuch, 5 books, or the Torah, the law of the Old Testament. Then we put it into the next phase is the history books. So, you know, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah. And then we come to the part about poetry, which is, you know, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. And then we come to the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. I might have missed 1 or 2 in there. But this is not the way that the Old Testament, the people of God in ancient times, thought of the division of their Bible. So if you see here the Tanakh, which is kind of it's actually an ancient acrostic, which was the way in which they divided up their Bible. The Torah, same as us, first 5 books, Genesis 1 through 11 and 12 through 50, and then Exodus through Deuteronomy were the kind of the subcategories within the Torah. Then they had what they called the Nevi'im, which were the prophets, and they actually included what we think of as the historical books as what they referred to as the former prophets. Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings were considered prophetic books because they trace the history of God's people from a prophetic perspective, i.e., in terms of what God was doing and how God was leading and guiding in the history of the people of God. And then they had the latter prophets, which for them included Job, and also Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Hosea through Malachi. Those were the latter prophets. And then they had this section of their Bibles, which they called the Ketuvim, which we sometimes just refer to as the scrolls or the writings. And here is where we find the wisdom literature of our Bibles, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. Interestingly, they also included Daniel among the writings, and interestingly also, the book of Chronicles was considered to them not a historical book, but one of the writings. Anyway, I show you all that to show you that the wisdom scrolls, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, let's get rid of that, are a section of the Old Testament all unto itself. The wisdom literature of ancient Israel is certainly an important part of the overall message of our Old Testament. It's been compared by the author of the chapter in the book that I'm using as a guide for this series. It's been compared to one single voice within a mass choir or within an ensemble of singers. The wisdom literature of the Old Testament has its own distinctive voice and its own part to play in the music of the Old Testament. And you might think of it as maybe the bass section or the baritones or the tenors. If that part stopped singing, the music would not feel as full, the harmony would not be as rich. The song is not complete without it. So as I've said, the wisdom literature primarily refers to these three books, Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes, but its themes and its characteristic perspectives are very present elsewhere in the Bible too, especially in the Psalms. Quite a few of the Psalms, including the first Psalm, speak with the voice of wisdom, the characteristic themes and messages of the wisdom books of the Old Testament. But today we're looking at the very beginning of the book, and these verses give a very good summary of what wisdom is all about. My study Bible has a note that says when teachers in colleges go to develop a new course on whatever subject it would be, they develop a syllabus, which says what this course is going to try to do and breaks down the different topics that are going to be discussed, sets forth a schedule for how that's going to go, tells you what your assignments are going to be, tells you how you're going to be graded on them, all that kind of thing. A syllabus is an important thing for a college course or seminary course, as Shirley is going through that these days in a kind of what must seem an interminable way. More and more courses all the time. Well, the first 7 verses of Proverbs 1 serve kind of like that syllabus. Here's what this book is going to be about. Here's what it's going to try to do for us. These 7 verses are kind of like the outline of the course, letting us know as students what we're in for and what wisdom has to teach us. Now let's focus first of all specifically on verse 7, since it is kind of the focal verse of this chapter in the book, the Old Testament in 12 verses, and it just says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fools despise." The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now, I suppose on the face of it, you might be scratching your head and saying, what do you mean, the fear of the Lord? Well, what on earth does being scared of God have to do with knowledge or being wise? And so it's important for us to understand what the Bible means and does not mean by this phrase, the fear of the Lord. Today we don't much like that notion, the concept of the fear of the Lord, because we assume that it means, well, if I have a proper fear of the Lord, then I live with a fear of being punished for something if I do wrong, a fear of punishment coming upon me from God if I don't do things right. And there are several meanings that are ascribed to this phrase, the fear of the Lord, in the Old Testament, but I have to tell you that not a single one of them has to do with the fear of imminent punishment. That's an idea that's crept into our modern minds without being supported by the meaning that is given to this phrase in the biblical text. What does it mean in the biblical text? Well, here and in other places in the book of Proverbs, the fear of the Lord refers to moral obedience. It refers to the acknowledgement that everything worth knowing and all real moral guidance comes to us from God. It's described here in the fact that a person who fears the Lord is open to instruction and wisdom and knowledge, but fools who do not fear the Lord despise wisdom and instruction. Fools, people who are not properly reverent before the Lord, have a tendency to think, I know everything I need to know, and you can't tell me anything, and I'm stuck in my ways, and I'm not going to listen to you. Being stuck in our ways and not listening is the opposite of the fear of the Lord, according to this verse. Well, what are some other meanings of the fear of the Lord in the Bible? In the book of Isaiah, in chapter 6, this famous story of Isaiah seeing the Lord high and lifted up the train of his robe filling the temple being filled with smoke, and angels flying back and forth in the temple, crying out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord. The whole earth is full of his glory." And it says Isaiah fell to the ground like a heap of thread that had just been torn out of a garment and left there. "I am undone," he says. That's the fear of the Lord, a trembling in the presence of the holiness of God. And in the book of Deuteronomy, the fear of the Lord refers to the covenant loyalty that the nation is asked and required to show to God, who has saved them and brought them forth from Egypt. And so all three of these biblical postures before God, here in Proverbs, the obedience; over in Isaiah, the awe; over in Deuteronomy, the loyalty to the covenant, all of them are responses to God's gracious activity. Our faith and our virtues and our seeking of knowledge are a response to God's first seeking us out. So the fear of the Lord, we begin here. The fear of the Lord is the impetus, the fuel, the goal of a life of faith. Our writer in this chapter is Dr. Tim Green, who teaches Old Testament and is the chair of the religion department at Trevecca Nazarene University in Nashville, Tennessee. And he writes here, reminding us that when it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, the Lord is a proper name, not just referring to any old god. Because in the ancient world, the gods had names. The Canaanites worshipped Baal or Molech. The Babylonians worshipped Bel or Nebo. Israel worshipped Yahweh, which is translated into our Bibles with usually all capital letters, the word Lord. The fear of Yahweh, the fear of Israel's God, not just any old God, but the fear of Israel's God, is the beginning of knowledge. And this phrase, this knowledge that it is God, as Israel has been introduced to him, God who has revealed himself to Israel, this is the essential context for this thesis that the beginning of knowledge is the fear of Yahweh. So the entry point into the thought of biblical wisdom is the reverent worship of and service to ancient Israel's distinct covenant God, Yahweh. And so in the minds of our biblical ancestors, that name would conjure up memories of all of the great things that God had done for them. The promises made to deliver them from Egypt, which God then fulfilled that promise in a mighty way through Moses, through the passage through the Red Sea. It conjured up memories of Israel gathering at the foot of Mount Sinai, receiving the law. It referred and reminded them of the journey through the wilderness and the final triumphant entry into the land 40 years later. And while biblical wisdom, Tim Green says, is certainly viewed as a human exercise that involves close observation and subsequent action, it is first viewed as God's gracious gift that precedes all human activity. So he's saying, if you want to be wise, according to the Bible, according to Israel's wisdom literature, you must first submit yourself to God. Submit yourself to this God who has reached out to us in love and drawn us to himself. So we might think of verse 7 as being like the motto of this whole book, and really of all of the wisdom literature. It's a theme, a short phrase that captures the theme of all of this wisdom writing in the Bible. The beginning of which it speaks, the fear of the Lord, is the beginning of knowledge. It doesn't refer just to a starting point that you then progress on from and leave behind. It's the beginning in terms of the first principle, the controlling principle, the most important thing of all, that you never leave behind. This is not merely a right method of thought, but a right relation to the one in whom are hidden all the riches of wisdom and knowledge. It refers to a worshiping submission to the God of the covenant, who has revealed himself to us by name. And so knowledge, in its first and most important sense, is not right thinking, it's actually right relating to God, being in right relationship, dependent on his revelation. And this knowledge is also inseparable from character, because as it goes on to say, fools despise all of this stuff. But if you're a person of character, you'll fear the Lord and you will gain the knowledge that he alone can give. And so, in order to be a person who was wise in the eyes of the sages of ancient Israel, you needed a lot more than just intelligence. You needed a lot more than just to be quick-witted. You needed a lot more than to be the teacher's pet in the class who always had the right answer. You needed so much more than that. You needed humility. You needed to be teachable. You needed to be oriented correctly toward this God who made you, to be in a relationship of obedience and awe and covenant loyalty towards this God who has created all that is. And so, having established that, we can look now at verses 2 through 6 and see that they kind of build towards this great statement, this motto in verse 7, and talk about all of the things that, as we take this course on wisdom, all of the things that it's going to help us in being able to do. And so you see that verses 2 through 6 have all of these 4 clauses, or clauses that speak of something that you'll be moving toward this as you take this course in wisdom. So it's for learning about wisdom and instruction, verse 2. It's for understanding, words of insight. It's for gaining instruction in wise dealing, justice, equity, righteousness. It's for teaching shrewdness to the simple, teaching people how to get along in the world and not be taken advantage of by others. It's for giving knowledge and prudence to the young, giving the kind of training in character building that is necessary for our children to grow and thrive. It's also for the wise, that they might increase their learning, as according to verse 5, let the wise also hear and gain even more in learning. And let the discerning acquire skill, it says, as you read through this book over and over again, and as you imbibe the wisdom of the sages, imbibe the knowledge and the fear of the Lord. It's good, it says, this wisdom, these proverbs are good for learning to understand a proverb and a riddle or a dark saying or something that just kind of puzzles you at first. Like, are you supposed to answer a fool according to his wisdom, according to his folly, or not? Well, it reminds me of a little prism ball that we sometimes hang in our front window that faces the south. And in the wintertime, when the sun is low, the rays of the sun come blazing through that window and they just look kind of yellowy white, right? That's what sunlight looks like, kind of yellowy white. But let it hit that prism ball, and suddenly all over our living room, walls and ceiling, there are these beautiful, brilliant little rainbows. And in a sense, that's what these verses 2 through 6 are doing, taking the plain light of wisdom that comes to us from God and putting them through a prism to see, so that you can see the distinctive colors, the distinctive purposes of this wisdom from God that comes into our lives, and see all of the beauty of what it is there for. The book of Proverbs opens up, says Derek Kidner, the plain daylight of wisdom into its rainbow of constituent colors. These all shade into one another, but any of them, in a sense, can be used to represent all the rest. Instruction or training, verse 2, the first synonym for wisdom. And it gives notice at once that wisdom will be hard won, that you have to submit yourself to instruction. You have to submit yourself to training, to doing things over and over again, repeating in ways that might seem like a drudgery, like dullness. That's what sometimes happens in courses where we're learning stuff, is that we have to work hard. Wisdom doesn't come to us just without any effort at all. It's not magic. It requires effort and training and instruction, as it says in verses 2 and 3. Give notice that wisdom will be hard won. It will be a fruit of our character as much as it is a fruit of our minds. Another set of synonyms appear in the latter part of verse 2. Understanding or insight. Speak of discernment. Speak of being able to decide between two options as to which one is the superior one. Wisdom allows you to do that. Verse 3, wise dealing, speaks to us of good sense, of practical wisdom, of which the verb form is often translated to be successful. So the wise dealing that verse 3 promises as we pursue wisdom is that we will be able to get along well in the world and we will succeed. Verse 4 speaks of shrewdness and discretion, and the book is largely concerned to show that the godly man, the godly woman, godly person is in the very best sense, a person who takes the trouble to know their way around in the world and who plans their course realistically. A person who is wise does not just flit from idea to idea to idea and constantly being, just like a wave of the sea, as James talks about. And then in verse 5, we have the words learning and discernment or knowledge. Not so much an informed mind as a knowing of truth and indeed a knowing of God himself, tending to emphasize that the knowledge of God is something given and received, not grasped and grabbed onto. And so this is teaching us that a wise life can be measured in terms of our engagement in right relationships with God and with other human beings and with all creation. This commitment to rightly ordered relationships is spoken of not only in wisdom books, but also in the Torah, the books of the law, and in the books of the prophets also, as these three words that are there in the latter part of verse 3, righteousness and justice and equity. Right relationship in the world is something that God wants to teach us and wants us to learn and to know and to grasp and to have the character necessary to be able to show these things, righteousness, justice, and equity in our relationships with others. Well, ultimately, wisdom seeks to provide a world in which understanding and knowledge and thoughtful discernment and critical reflection and disciplined insight and right-related living become the norm for us, just become our way of life. Anything otherwise would become life in opposition to the wisdom of God, would become foolishness. Well, these verses give to us an introduction to what I have referred to in the title of this sermon as the world of wisdom. And as I've said before, the voice of wisdom is an important part of the mass choir that is the message of the Old Testament. And you might consider spending some time in these books, Ecclesiastes, Job, and Proverbs, to befriend this part of our Bibles, this wisdom tradition, if you will. And if you decide to do that, then an understanding of several deep convictions of this literature will help you. These are some guiding principles that you keep in mind as we read through these books. First of all, that the gift of the created order and the God-given human capacity to perceive that order is one of the fruits of wisdom. There's a deep conviction in this book of Proverbs, that God has created all things in an orderly manner, and so that within God's creation there's a divinely implanted order that is observable to us as human beings. That's why in our language, subjects of study often end with the four letters L-O-G-Y. That's a move back to logos, the Greek word for the word or the wisdom of God. Bio logos or logi is the study of living things, that sort of thing. Biology, theology, the study of divine things, of godly things. Wisdom leads human beings to observe, to ask questions, to think deeply, to discover, to imagine, and to implement what today would be referred to as our natural sciences and our social sciences and the arts and the use of words in speech and poetry. So we are invited into God's wisdom, that we would be the thinking and relational and creative and imaginative and reasoning and expressive images of God that are called to engage fully in and with all of God's creation. A second conviction of the wisdom literature of the Bible is that there are two pathways to life in life, and they lead to very distinctive ends. This is embodied in that psalm that I mentioned a moment ago, Psalm 1. Blessed are those who do not walk in the counsel of the ungodly, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers, but their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law they meditate day and night. They will be like trees planted by streams of living water, which bear their fruit in season, and their leaves do not wither. Not so the wicked. They are like chaff that the wind drives away. You see, this way of thinking really represents life as being a choice between two ways, either the way of the wise or the way of the fool. One way leads to life, one way leads to death. One way leads to reward, to fullness, to accomplishment, to success, to joy. Other way leads to frustration, to inability to do anything of worth and value. There's this strong understanding within the wisdom literature that there's really only two ways that you can go in life. It envisions all human beings standing at a fork in the road, deciding day by day whether I'll take the way of the wise or the way of the fool. Each of the two pathways has a clear end or destination, either life or death. So, two ways, that's something that you see throughout the wisdom literature of Israel. A third conviction, that wisdom takes its place in the world in terms not of just intelligence, but in terms of wise embodied living. And so, as we said earlier, these proverbs contain observations and teachings about a huge variety of different subjects. Common life matters as diverse as temper tantrums, laziness, gossip, gluttony and drunkenness, character formation, pride, sexual passion, jealousy, wise counsel, marriage and raising children, troublemaking, spoken words, today we would say typed words, the workplace, the honorable treatment of the elderly. In other words, wisdom passionately cares about the everyday life that is lived in the real life, flesh and blood, here and now. And the fourth conviction that our author Tim Green names about wisdom literature is that you will see that the wisdom literature argues with itself. That's an interesting aspect of it. Some wisdom literature texts talk so certainly about the fact that the way of wisdom is the way of blessing, the way of fruitfulness, the way of joy, the way of goodness, the way of success, that it can kind of make you go, are you serious? Do you live in the same world I live in? And so the wisdom literature has another book called Job, which asks those very questions. Really, people? Are you always going to say that every person who chooses the right way doesn't suffer, doesn't go through hard times? Look at Job. And the whole book of Job is an argument that sometimes life is a bit more complicated than that. Sometimes the way of righteous living doesn't lead towards all of these wonderful things. The book of Job dares to disagree vehemently with such a dogmatic understanding, raising his voice with the honest and sincere lament of grief and dismay and abandonment that is found in other Old Testament writings. Job boldly curses the day he was born and refuses to back down when his friends confront him. So this is an observation about the writings in the wisdom tradition, that although they have these strong convictions, there are also dissenting voices and ways in which the tradition continues to wrestle with these questions. Job and Ecclesiastes also wrestle with the question of whether people pursue the path of wisdom with honest sincerity, or whether they do so for the ulterior motive of receiving a greater reward at the end of the path. This is the constant temptation that we're so familiar with in terms of the prosperity gospel. And there's a ton of preachers out there, many of them on TV, because it's a really rich-making kind of message that say, do the right thing and support our ministry, and God's just going to bless the socks off you. Name it and claim it, your blessing, your prosperity that God will give to you. The book of Job and the book of Ecclesiastes both say, don't follow that way of thinking. Don't follow God because of what you can get out of it. Don't become a covenant loyal person with the idea that if you do that, everything's just going to go great in your life. It's the wrong motive for worshiping God. Well, as I come to conclusion, I can recognize that the wisdom tradition continues throughout the rest of the Old Testament and on even into the writings that we're not very familiar with, the writings of the Jewish people in between the time of the Testaments. And it even goes further. The earlier followers of Jesus, as they testified to who he was, they took a further step and confessed that Jesus was himself, the very wisdom of God in flesh and blood. Gospel of John says, the Word, the Logos, the wisdom of God became flesh in this human being who walked among us. We have seen and testified of him. He himself is the way of God's truth that leads to life. And Jesus himself describes all who will listen to his words and build their lives on those words as a wise person who built a house upon a rock. Jesus is a part of the wisdom tradition. In fact, he is its destination. He is the supreme example of the wise person, and he tells us that if we are wise enough to build our lives upon his teaching and upon his example, we will experience the stability, the groundedness, and the joy of a life that is firmly in touch with God reality. My friends, let us fix this truth deep in our hearts and souls. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It is only fools who despise wisdom and instruction. So choose wisdom, choose life. Amen.